My name is Thomas Hale. I'm a fellow here in the college and a professor at the School of Government, the Robotics School here in Oxford, and it's my pleasure to be helping with this series this year. As you will have, if you've been following the series, will know, we are focused in this election year on the issue of climate change. So we're looking at different ways in which the UK might make progress toward achieving its climate goals as part of a broader global effort. And of course, we're looking at some of the opportunities, but also challenges that arise around that. I'm delighted that our two visiting parliamentary fellows this year, to my immediate left, Chris Skidmore, a few streets further left, Sybil, are working with us to bring the attention to this vital issue. Before we begin, I should remind you this is being broadcast to all of you joining us online on YouTube. So if you are here and wish to make private statements, just keep that in mind. Today's focus is going to be on two important topics and one incredibly important entity, local authorities, and the question of transportation and infrastructure. So our title is Moving and Building. How do we build what we need to build? How do we move around in a world where we also need to meet our climate goals? And of course, a world shaped by climate change. And even though all levels of government are important for that challenge, local authorities are particularly important for that challenge. And indeed, I think the climate issue is one of the, well, there are probably several, but one of the most the clearest issues where the role of local government is really important. And in every different political system, that's going to be true, but it's interestingly true in, well, let's say, idiosyncratic ways in all countries, and here in the UK, a really important one for us to consider. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by a great panel, and I'll whisper them actually from the far side coming here. Chris Hammond is the leader of UK 100, which is a fantastic organization working with leading local government champions on climate around the UK. And of course, he brings experience to that issue as a former head of the Southampton Council. Councillor Anna Railton will be known to you, who is here in Oxford. She is a city councillor here in the city, and she is also the cabinet member for Net Zero and Climate Justice. So thinking a lot of those top contexts here in Oxford. And just next to Alex, between Alex and Chris, is Pete Sudbury, who is a county councillor here in Oxfordshire and is leading on climate work in the county council. So we have great expertise from around the country, from Westminster and from very close to home. And what better people to think about this important topic. Our format tonight will be, as we've done in recent recent sessions. So we're going to have a bit of a sort of talk show style discussion. We're going to ask short questions to our panel to come in on. We're going to divide that into a few different segments. First looking at transportation, first looking at buildings, then looking at transportation, and then coming back to some of the bigger picture questions. We want to make sure we save a lot of time for questions and discussions. So please be thinking about your points that you'd like to raise as we're going through, because we'll save some time for that, a good amount of time for that toward the end. Obviously, this conversation is happening a week after a really important set of elections took place at the local level all around the country. And so obviously when you're thinking about these questions, front of mind, it was a bit of a significant set of local elections, I would say, and of course happening in the run up to a general election. So before we dive into the topic, I might just turn to Chris and Alex to sort of address the big elephant that people are thinking of. What do we infer, what can be inferred, if anything, from the elections last week for this topic of climate change? What can we take away going forward? I wonder, Alex, if I come to you first, and then
Sure.
Chris.
I mean, we need to remember that last week there were mayoral elections, and actually many more people voted in mayoral elections than they did in council elections. And council elections on a ward basis are very, very different. So actually, if you want to infer something, it's probably more important that we look at the mayoral elections. Now, if you remember back to the Uxbridge by-election, the Conservatives retained Uxbridge, basically running a very hard campaign on ULEZ before the introduction of ULEZ. They made claims for ULEZ.
Just to make sure everyone knows, ULEZ is the
ultra low emission zone in London, which you have to pay particularly for older diesel vehicles. And actually, this is part of the problem, was that there was an impression given, I'm going to be kind, there's an impression given in the by-election that nearly all cars would have to pay ULEZ. And so this meant people in Uxbridge, and I had it on the doorstep when I was in Uxbridge campaigning there, didn't want to vote for Labour because of Sadiq Khan's introduction of ULEZ. And Susan Hall, the candidate, ran very hard on sort of anti-ULEZ ticket, and a number of other candidates to the right of Susan Hall also. I registered to vote in London as well as in Leeds, and I read the booklet, and the two most anti-ULEZ were actually the SDP, So, which is not the same SDP that joined the Liberal Democrats, and Britain First, and they sort of were way beyond where Susan Hall was. They were going to scrap everything: the congestion charge, ULEZ, low traffic neighbourhoods, you name it, they were going to scrap it. It was going to be a free for all on the streets of London. And actually, what happened was that Sadiq Khan increased the majority in London. In actually quite a difficult third term, quite a difficult set. Nationally, obviously, it's easy for the Labour Party, but in the local context of London, it was quite difficult for Sadiq to increase the majority. And it just shows that people, when they know the reality of measures, and then they become, particularly if they become used to them, then it becomes less of a factor. And this is always what happens. I have this all the time locally in Leeds, where we're going to change the road junction, we install cycle lanes, whatever it is, it's all a low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm a particularly big fan of low traffic neighbourhoods. And then people are, as a minority, sometimes occasionally a majority of people are opposed. Then after the measures come in, they see the improvement, and then they change their minds. And it's an electoral issue before, generally not after. And I think that is what we need to contend with. I was going to talk about solar farms, but I'll leave that maybe for later in the discussion.
I'm sure I'll plenty of time to get into that issue as well. But interesting thoughts. Chris, any takeaways from you from the election?
So obviously I'm independent, non-party political now, having sort of resigned back in January. But my observations was that those candidates that offered hope and a positive future-facing vision of the future were rewarded at the ballot box. And that both looks at the local authorities, where you saw the Greens make huge strides, missing out on sort of the majority by one. But if you told me as a Bristolian that the Greens would almost have swept the board, 5, certainly 10 years ago, I simply wouldn't have believed you. The Greens had virtually no seats back 10 years ago. And so to see sort of certain areas where they've come forward is, I think, leading a revolution. And actually, not in the sense of the revolutionary sense, but sort of in terms of politically, and this is a silent sort of earthquake that is happening. So if you look at the number of seats the Greens won, it's 156 seats. Reform won 2 seats down in Havant. The amount of media coverage they've had, being on Question Time, on Newsnight, even as sort of unelected so-called politicians, when we know they're not a political party, they're a private company, of which Nigel Farage owns 53% of shares. Actually, the Greens have managed to make these advances without having that political exposure, at the centre in the media. So I do think that there is a sense where the public do want to see those politicians taking climate seriously. And obviously, on the other side, Ben Houchen, the sole mayoral sort of victory up in Teesside, he has been a proud proponent of net zero, in spite of the net zero rollback that's happened under Rishi Sunak, which is one of the reasons obviously why I resigned over new oil and gas licenses. Ben Houchen came out and published a Teesside net zero strategy in which he said, this is not about what we have to give up, this is about what we have to gain. And he lent into net zero as an opportunity for regeneration, creating new jobs, ripping a leaf out of Joe Biden's sort of playbook on the Inflation Reduction Act, demonstrating this sort of manufacturing revolution. I do think that's one of the reasons why Ben Houchen stood out as one of the sole examples of the Conservatives winning. It may not have been against the odds, but again, I don't care about party politics here. It is the fact that he demonstrated that vision in the same way other parties have demonstrated a positive vision. And again, to come back to the point on ULEZ, again, Sadiq Khan increased his vote share, increased his majority. People have got used to the fact that they were willing to buy into this false narrative that everyone was being sort of hit by ULEZ, when it was in fact sort of like 5% of all cars, and many of those cars were sort of ready for the scrap heap anyway. And it's now dampened down, and then they make the transition and the change. So for me, politicians that actually show bravery and know that they need to take change with them in their local communities, have been rewarded, and that is the lesson of the elections last week.
Yeah, really interesting results. I think even though the broad contours may be well perceived by polls, certainly the media narrative has missed some of these key points around what are people actually voting for, what do they want their government to deliver for them, which is interesting as we look ahead to the general election. Let's, with that sort of political introduction, let's zoom now to the actual 2 issues we're thinking about today. Building things and moving around, because this is actually really the core of the net zero challenge in many ways. There's the energy system, of course, which we're going to touch on, but I think let's focus if we can on the second and third biggest piece, which are infrastructure, buildings, housing, and transportation. Let's start with buildings first. So obviously meeting climate goals requires a lot of both building and rebuilding our houses, our different kinds of infrastructure. And it's really challenging because in a world of now higher interest rates, the ability for governments to do so has become much more constrained. We're having to think about different financing models. We're having to think about how to build consensus around some things that are hard to do politically. And it's a lot of different things. It doesn't sort of fall nicely into one ministry or one sort of department or one portfolio. It's really kind of a cross-cutting sort of thing. And of course, a lot of it happens in decisions at the local level, either planning decisions or housing authority kind of choices, or these sort of different parts of the governance system. So, Chris, can you start us off by saying a bit more what you see as the key priorities for the UK on building, and really what is the thing that local authorities in particular need to really grasp? If you were thinking about Teesside or Oxford or anywhere in between, what would be at the top of your agenda? Alex, can we come back to you first?
Sure. I think that the UK lacks something really fundamental, and that's that we don't know exactly what's happening on our land, and we don't really have a framework of how to utilise the land. There's been a lot of work done in the House of Lords, particularly by Baroness Young, on developing a land use framework, and the government committed to implement the land use framework and have failed to do so. It will become much easier because we're a small island and we're constrained to land, particularly in England. If we in sort of US enactors zoned our land and said this land is suitable for housing, for energy use, for transport use, you know, for whatever the uses are, for nature, for agriculture, which obviously the major uses of land. And once you have that, then you can things will flow from that. Because at the moment we've got an outdated planning system. The greenbelt designations are really old, and the nature of the land has changed. And we have this new sort of, it's not really a designation, but the so-called grey belt, which is, you know, things that are designated as green belt, which really aren't green belt. And once we've got the land use framework, we can then try and reform the planning system around it. I also really think that we need to have a fabric-first approach in building. We're still building the wrong buildings, whether that's houses or commercial industrial buildings. And we can build houses now which effectively need no heating in the winter and no cooling in the summer. And it just really is about, one, there's a little bit of work within the building industry to do that. We have lots of examples of built environments that act like that. But we need the regulations to go further. So we've got the Future Home Standard. The Future Home Standard isn't good enough. So some local authorities, and I asked Michael Gove this the other week, want their, I don't know whether it's the case in Oxford and Oxfordshire, want their planning standards to go beyond. But the way that DLUHC have phrased it, it sounds as though you are at the standard and that's it. So I asked Michael whether local authorities that had good, you know, planning policy and that had, you know, a strong ability to deliver could go beyond, and he said he'd look into it. And so I particularly asked this for my city in Leeds, and the executive member then, this is the power of local authorities, wrote a letter to Marco Maxwell for a meeting. She's not had a response yet, so I'm going to follow up with him. But I think that if local authorities are able to go beyond government standards, and they should, we should really view standards regulations as a floor, not a ceiling. And I think the government got this quite badly wrong, that the future standard is both the floor and the ceiling effect.
Right, really interesting. So get land reform, land registration better, so we know what we're dealing with, and then really focus on the building stock. Chris, what would you add to the?
So obviously, transport responsible for a third of our emissions. Buildings responsible for about 25% of our emissions, make up a far greater proportion than just simply looking at the power sector, which obviously if you look at as the UK as being a sort of leading example of decarbonising our electricity system. So it's buildings and transport is where we really need to focus our attention, particularly if we're going to meet our carbon budgets. And that's not new; it's set out by the Committee on Climate Change and their progress report on what needs to be done. For me, predominantly, the issue is one of both trust and money. Just to cover off, Alex, the planning system and all those things are really important. Also, make sure we get the regulatory approaches. But to add to that, we just have elections. I mentioned about that positive future-facing vision. People trust their local councillors more than they do their Westminster politicians, and that's just sort of the facts of life when you look at polling. And so, therefore, giving councillors, giving mayors greater responsibilities, greater powers to be able to enact change on the ground, understanding that they'll be held responsible for and accountable, is really important. And we do need, better data architecture to create that sense of responsibility and accountability. Because at the moment, we're comparing apples and pears. We can't compare one local authority with another, unlike with recycling rates, because we don't have the data frameworks in place. But for me, most importantly, and I did a report, I'm sure we'll talk about this, with UK 100 called Zero In, came out last month as part of our sort of local climate pledge 2024, was that we're going to have to do this anyway. We're going to have to spend the money to decarbonise buildings and to decarbonise our transport system. So why is the government endlessly running competitive bids, pitching local authorities against one another? Since I signed Net Zero into law in 2019, councils have spent £137 million, not on anything to do with decarbonising, but simply on the paperwork of applying to actually bid for the competitions. And the challenge we've got is this process, this sort of sausage factory, means that people are endlessly having to apply for short-term bids, for small pots of money, and then fight like rats in a sack with other local authorities. And it simply means that if we can continue with that process, we're not going to be able to give local authorities the funds that are needed. And I would go to a grant-based system, look at how we can create a longer-term approach, like they've done in Germany with their KfW process of decarbonising homes through retrofit. Have a 10-year plan. Don't have a 3-year wraparound spending review, which you give councils these pots of money, which then 150 local authorities have to bid against each other. Some local authorities now stop bidding because they simply don't have the time or the effort or the money to be able to even apply to get more money. And that is farcical in usage.
There's some real parallels there with some of the work we do in my realm on international climate finance, where indeed many countries find themselves applying to things like the Green Climate Fund or others for small pots of money. It's extremely expensive applications to put together, often having to pay external consultants to do that, who it's not really maybe the best use of those precious public funds. That's the sort of big picture. Chris, can I turn to you next, Chris Hammond, and ask about the local authorities that you work with, the UK 100. Where are they seeing the challenges and the opportunities around this? I mean, some of them laid out here, but where is the emphasis for them?
I think what we see is a real kind of lack of capacity. You've got these organisations which have, over the last 10 years, 10, 12 years, had a significant amount of their budgets restricted. We've seen their cost base go up, demand for their services increase. And councils, people tend to think their council does the bins and the potholes, and probably that's about it. But some councils have hundreds of services. The council that I used to lead had 700 different services. And if you was to create a business, you wouldn't create a council in the way that they're all created and structured at the moment. So they're really unique authorities. And there's different levels of council across the country. So there's different politicians all having different viewpoints about what should happen in their areas. So it's quite a complicated system. That's the starting point. But anytime you try and do any big reorganization of any public sector body, it takes years, it takes budget, and then you don't always necessarily get the outcomes that you wanted when you embarked on those. But specifically, I mean, building on 2 excellent points already that we've heard, but councils don't have the capacity in the building space to do the enforcement. So we've got an absolute crisis in this country with not enough planning officers in councils passing planning applications, getting kind of the gubbins through the system in the first place, but also to take that enforcement action. I think less than 20 councils have taken enforcement action on sort of energy efficiency standards since 2020. I mean, that is outrageous when you think about it. There are hundreds of councils in this country that have a planning authority role within them. So we don't have as many planning officers, which means that the system is slower. You get these bottlenecks. We need planning reform changes so that we're building the kinds of buildings that we want to see that are net zero. We've got to get a little bit tougher with the developers. We can't let them have this viability, get out of jail free card. I've been to far too many planning committee meetings where you see these crocodile tears. Well, we can't afford to do affordable housing. We're going to get the same thing around net zero commitments as well. So we need to be tougher. We need to be proportionate and pragmatic. But at the same time, if we want those higher standards, we want councils to set standards above the government's floor, not the ceiling, then we need to back them up. And at the moment, the system doesn't back up councils in the way that it should do. So We talked about the planning inspectorate. So when an application is referred to the planning inspectorate, an independent person will look at the application. And where they're challenged on environmental grounds or net zero grounds, it's really hit and miss whether or not the planning inspectorate will back up the council who are applying their own local plan and their own kind of standards on net zero. So it's a quite complicated system. The whole planning system needs a real good look at it. But for me, if I was to pick the one thing, I think if we could get really good enforcement back in the planning system so that we are driving up those standards, the ones that we agree to and the ones that we've passed as planning conditions in our local areas, I think that will be transformative.
Right. Can you just say one more word about if getting enforcement of planning rules is the number one ask, what would be 2 and 3, just to, from your perspective, just know what the priorities might look like?
So again, I think making sure that the planning inspector, I think, is key. But I think if we go back to this ring-fenced funding, I think if we genuinely want to transform the way that we build, and if we want local authorities to become builders again, in a way that they were significantly in the past, hundreds of thousands of homes were built by councils. It's more than money, because when Theresa May lifted the cap on local authorities being able to borrow to build, a lot of us in the sector thought that would be absolutely transformative. And it started councils building, but the capacity and the skills and the expertise that had disappeared over decades didn't come back overnight. So again, if we're wanting councils to become builders or to help shape the market and put money in, there needs to be that capacity. I heard recently in a speech that I thought was quite telling, we've seen local authority officers, the number of sort of local civil servants effectively, shrink by around 1 million since 2011, yet the civil service has grown roundabout by 1 million. Now, it's not been like for like, of course not, but it just shows that the direction of travel has been in the wrong way. That's now starting to change. And I think the fact that you've got kind of a broad consensus by all the political parties, there needs to be more local action, I think is really quite positive.
That's a really fascinating statistic, really big numbers. Let's take this conversation home, if you will. And if we turn to you next and say, here in Oxford, obviously we have an ambitious climate agenda. Where are the challenges, where are the opportunities? Which of these points we've heard already are biting locally, and what are the other ones we're missing?
Okay, so I will start off with a positive thing that came from central government, which is an example of funding being done well, which was the Levi funding. So this is the funding for EV infrastructure, and this was basically, it was effectively just sort of divvied up among all of the tier 1 local authorities. There was no competition. It was just sort of allocated. And it's just been like, you get on with it. So, it can happen, and it was really good to see that. So certainly locally, I would say, sort of capacity in the planning system, it's not just at the enforcement end, it's at the other end as well. So certainly, in Oxford, obviously, I mostly see my role in sort of net zero. Oxford's kind of agenda is mostly about buildings, actually. It's not really about transport for us, it's mostly about buildings. And a lot of that is about retrofit. And of course, we have great big bottlenecks in the sort of planning officer capacity thing in the retrofit space as well. So, certainly, during the pandemic, lots of people in Oxford saved up lots of money sometimes, and they sort of looked at their house and like, oh, actually, I'd like to make some improvements. I'm going to put some PV. I'm going to sort of do some energy improvements. I'm going to finally upgrade these windows and whatever. And then, of course, there was basically a bit of a tidal wave of kind of planning applications which hit the sort of the heritage teams. Obviously, big concern in Oxford, and certainly, the energy team as well, with respect to basically lots of people submitting essentially the same planning application over and over again to do very similar things on very similar streets. So I think there's something here around almost sort of permission in advance. So on a street by street basis, I read a very good sort of a white paper on this. Is basically you go down the street, the planning officer's like, okay, houses X, Y, Z can put PV on the roof. ABC can put in a heat pump. You can put this type of window in, whatever, and this will very much just kind of it will just increase the capacity, and maybe we can get some more stuff done. Certainly delivery on a local scale. Certainly, I think the 2 big constraints we've got are very much is actually grid connections, right? So we have a very ambitious local plan that's just gone out for examination. Basically, no gas connections from when it's signed off, but we are going to probably be in the situation where we have a local plan we cannot actually fulfil because the grid connection is not there. So we may actually be forced to put gas boilers into stuff because the grid capacity is not there. And that is probably actually the number one. I mean, we've sort of realised this early, but actually this is going to be a gigantic problem across the entire country.
And one we see in many, many places. But I love a positive example where it actually worked well and a good model maybe to follow. Also an idea for how some of the planning system could be streamlined by packaging some things together where it doesn't need to be quite so bespoke. As someone who lives in an older house in Oxford, I would like that very much, I would say. What about the county level, Pete? You're thinking about some similar set of issues, but obviously some quite different challenges, maybe more in the land use and transportation categories than you think about in the city.
Okay, so I'm a psychiatrist by trade, and I was a senior leader in the NHS, so I'm used to working in a system that is utterly configured to get things wrong. And I have to say local government is a lot less well configured for that. I think we do have to note that at national level you've got virtually state capture by a vested interest, that planning law is effectively dictated by developers who by and large don't want to spend more money on doing houses. And there is that awful frustrating sense that we're actually trying to run up a down escalator because we are building tens of thousands of houses in Oxfordshire now that we know aren't up to scratch. They're not up to scratch on insulation. They're also, the Climate Change Committee has been saying for 5 years you needed to change building regs to make sure houses don't overheat, and that's not happened. So there are houses that will freeze people in winter and cook them in summer, and they're building them all the time. We have in Oxfordshire probably the most comprehensive plan ever written to decarbonise an entire county. It's called Pathways to Zero Carbon Oxfordshire, and its godfather, Nick Eyre, Professor Nick Eyre is sitting in the audience. We got a £6 million grant. We're quite good at getting bids, winning those bids in the cats in a sack thing. And we got a £6 million grant to do retrofit. And I think I worked out that we need one of those every fortnight till 2030 to meet the targets on retrofit set by PASCO. That's so it's not just the fact that you're scrabbling to get bids, it's that the numbers are 10 times wrong. One good story, West Oxfordshire had a development, Saltcross, which they designated as zero carbon. The developers challenged it, and a couple of the usual compliant planning inspectors ruled that it was neither necessary nor right to have zero carbon. They actually took them to judicial review and won. So sometimes, and actually every now and then, I'm in the Green Party, and the Greens are quite keen on this legal stuff, and every now and then the law does come out with a very sensible decision. Judges do make the right judgments on what is good. So you can get this through, but it is an awful shame that in order to build the houses we should have been building for the last decade, you had to go to court or go into judicial review. And I assume that a future government that isn't this one might change that.
Great, thank you. Echoing the point on enforcement from Chris, let's just make sure we're expanding the conversation to include the transportation question, because I think this is one where, going back to where we started on politics, where we see actually even more salience coming up, both locally and of course around the country. So let me come back to Chris to start us off again. Obviously, we know meeting our climate goals requires decarbonizing transportation. That means shipping EVs, as we talked a little bit, but probably also switching much more to public transportation, cycling, feet, other things as well. People seem to have some strong views on the subject. So the politics are really important to get right. But maybe we're seeing some hope from that, optimistic visions, going back to your earlier point from the elections last week. So what are the key priorities you think local government should be thinking about in the broader national pathway down?
Yeah, sure. So I think, transport 33% emissions, it's got to be a priority, and I think not just for 2050, but for 2030. We're going to try and meet our NDC, the national determined contribution, 68% emissions reductions. We're at 50% now. We've got to be able. There is an ambition gap that is emerging, and the CCC have been sort of clear on that. So there is an opportunity. That's why I saw the roadmap from Rishi Sunak on electric vehicles as being sort of tragic, because ultimately it means a second-hand car market to be able to be developed, to be able to meet sort of the needs people to be able to afford electric vehicles. But equally, and the Net Zero review was clear on that, even if everyone moves to electric vehicles, we still need a fundamental modal shift in the way we do transport. So again, another tragedy, HS2, and one of you could argue one of the reasons why Andy Street lost was because Rishi Sunak's decision to can the rest of the line for HS2. But that is also a climate measure, taking all that freight off the motorways. And actually, when you look at sort of opportunities to decarbonise, Eurostar is essentially actually the lowest carbon alternative we have compared to trains on the in the UK. Now, what can local authorities do? So they can't solve the train issue. Even if we wanted to devolve that, it's got to be sort of planned at a sort of national sort of level. But what local authorities can do, and again, where it was tragic for the government to cut the active travel budget, is come up with visionary statements for demonstrating what's the opportunity, what's the art of the possible. Because that's where with transport, it's very difficult. No one local authority is the same. You speak to someone like Richard Clure at Wiltshire County Council, he wants to be able to move people onto buses, but it's just economically even difficult, even with sort of £1 fare sort of scheme that's in place, because actually physically getting the buses and the routes and the networks in place is hugely difficult. And I would argue that we have had a failure in governance on buses, partly due to privatisation of buses, and what that's meant is having these sort of dark spots where you don't have the services in place, even if you want to use them. But where active travel, where cycles, the lanes, where the 15-minute city route or 15-minute location, when I was an MP, I would have campaigned for a 15-minute sort of constituency where everyone can get around on public transport within 15 minutes to get to their doctors, to get to their libraries, to get to their schools. See, we are, and this is the challenge, is that where local authorities can help, I think, sort of break down this sort of national dimension around a culture war, of actually demonstrating that this is about locally elected politicians identifying local solutions that might be quite bespoke for different areas. And that's why I think we really need to focus attention. Government should provide the financing for that, but should give the freedom to local authorities to be able to identify what are those solutions. But it isn't going to be one size fits all for every local authority. The makeup, as Alex has said, and the land use of those local authorities will be vastly different. So there will be different sort of transport solutions depending on the local authority, but we should get for the local authority and council authorities to work together, to come together, in setting out a roadmap and a vision.
I think that makes a roadmap for roads would be a great thing. Alex, what can we add to that?
I think if you think about the earlier question, we're building new houses, we need to think about how people are going to travel, and we should be building new houses with an ambition that they don't need to own a car. So that's sort of what we're talking about, last 3 mile, sort of, or first 3 mile of the journey. What we need to do in those new estates to ensure that people don't need a car. So 2 things. One is look at alternatives, e-bike schemes, mass transit in urban areas, car clubs, EV car clubs with infrastructure, and also digital connectivity. So where they don't need to make journeys, and they don't make the journeys, and they work on, work from home. I know there's a lot of pressure on that, opposed to that as well. But I think that's where the future's going. And then more broadly, if we think about it as an ecosystem, so everybody's journey can be done without a car through multimodal transport. And local authorities got a real role here. So there's a few things they can do. One, who controls the roads? Obviously, national highways not, but local roads all controlled by local authorities. So they can make it easier for the buses to run faster than the cars. They can make it easier for the bikes. They can make it easier for pedestrians, and they can help with the infrastructure. As Anna said, the levy scheme and all of that sort of thing in terms of building EV infrastructure. I think that we're really in a sort of intermediate point in terms of transport, because I feel this quite strongly. In 10, 15, 20 years, car ownership is effectively dead. Because once autonomous electric vehicles come in, a mass level, who's going to own a car? Nobody. What's the point of owning a car when the car comes to you? So we really need to resolve this part in this point in history, which is why actually it's really sad that we're trying to hold on to internal combustion engine vehicle, because that is in that as relevant as a horse and cars in 20 years. And we really need to make that transition and really be pushing that transition. But I think public transport's here to stay. Whether the bus drives itself or there's a bus driver in it, will still be the buses. And I think local has got a real role in redesigning their areas for that transport future.
As you say, some of the building choices we make have really lasting legacies for the transportation choices we make. And even though technology can change quite quickly, physical layouts of cities much harder to change. So important choices there. Chris, what are the local councils you're working with asking for on this? What are their priorities? Where are they seeing it?
Well, no surprise, it would be money, firstly. If you think about the bus service improvement round of funding that came out a couple of years ago, there was 10 times as much money bid that was available. So the ambition is there. And what Alex said about kind of planning the whole kind of economic development and the sense of place is integral to what local authorities do. And that alignment between where the housing goes and where the public transport corridors are isn't as comprehensive or as integrated as it should be. But if you think about what you want public transport to look like, it needs to be convenient, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be plentiful. In cities, we can broadly get most of those three, but in the more rural areas, there is no way possible, as Chris was saying, around one of the councils that we work with, you're able to do it. And so let's not make things harder for ourselves by building what I call sort of orphan estates. So you drop a load of houses in the middle of the countryside, you don't connect it up to anything, and there's usually no even pavements for people to walk to the nearest shop. So they then have to get in their car. There's no way, if you live in some of our new build estates, you can get about in any other way unless you want to cycle and you might be too far to get to your nearest workplace. So we need to align those. We need to look at the public transport systems so that they align to where people work and where people want to go. A lot of the public transport systems will get you in to the city centre, the town centre, and that's it.
Yeah.
But that's not where all the workplaces are. So then that creates unnecessary journeys for people to do. One, I think, really good example of this, because even in the big urban areas, outside of London, where you've got one set of branding, where you've got one kind of ticketing system, where you've got one app, one mode of kind of, it's very easy if you're a consumer in London or a passenger to try and get about. The B network in Greater Manchester, what Andy Burnham has done, has been absolute. I predict that would be one of the most transformative transport systems outside of London in this country, because they've addressed those three kind of challenges: single branding, kind of cross-ticketing of routes at one ticket price for a lot of it, and electric buses, as many as possible. They want to have electric buses in entirety. So that becomes a genuine alternative for people to use the car. And I think Alex is right around the future of where this technology is. But the current place at the moment is that people have a emotional as well as a kind of a logical attachment to their car. You know, the brand of car that they buy, the way that it looks, it feels, is an extension of their homes. So where you're seeing a lot of this pushback on transport changes in this country is because people feel like the alternative isn't there. So they see the stick being used, but they don't see a carrot in any other way. So I think that's something we have to be mindful of. There's a reason that transport emissions have not shifted in the same way that, say, the energy market emissions have. And this is going to be the new, hopefully not, but this will be the new kind of frontier of climate action. How do we get to a place where we are now to where we need to be in a kind of as painless way possible? And I think that's going to require a new way of implementing public policy and kind of new engagement by councils with communities, because imposed in is going to get blowback. Not as popular as some politicians may have thought. And I think, you know, the ULEZ, the city and the London mayoral results have shown that. But this is going to require some sort of fleet of foot work by councils and engaging their communities to get transport changed.
And I'm very curious to hear everyone's thoughts on what those carrots look like, if you will, to accompany the stick. So what's going to make this really attractive and compelling in this optimistic vision of the future that people want to be part of? I think that's the key to figure out. But let's go local, and if I could go first to Pete this time, then to you, Adam. At the county level, what are we doing in transport? What can we do more of? What are the challenges? Where are we going next?
Okay, I think we've already been talking about the challenges in rural areas. Rural and semi-rural areas are much harder to do. And if you look at all the great transport things like Ghent and so on, they're about a city, and they take out thousands of really short journeys. And if you look in Oxfordshire, only 10% of transport emissions are in the city, and the rest are in the county, because there it's much more difficult to put in public transport, because the start and finish of the journeys is so much more varied, and the journeys are longer. So from a climate point of view, actually, when you look at things like Ghent, you're not even sure if it reduces emissions, because more cars go around the ring road. So in climate terms, we need to be thinking about how we reduce the number of journeys and electrify fast in the county. So what we did at the county was we put chargers in car parks in 20 market towns, 250 chargers, made in fact by a local company even. And then the next thing you do is you put in a car club, because in rural areas car dependency is quite high. You probably need one car, but you could get rid of the second car. Car clubs are a great way of reducing the number of cars, and if you think about an electrified world, when zero carbon electricity, almost all the damage done to the climate, to the environment by an EV is before it hits the road at all. So if you can reduce the number of cars, that's a real win. It's also a win for the consumer. You don't have to buy and insure and everything else a second car, because your second car by and large sits and rots on the drive and costs you a lot. So there is a win-win there. The other thing that we need to think about with the next stage on it is V2G, because one of my other hats is climate resilience, and the big fear is grid collapse, isn't it? The grid goes down because you have a superstorm or anything else. And if you have a microgrid and you have your EVs connected to that, that actually can help you stand the grid up for a period of time, and that might be really very useful. And so, although I like the idea of cars becoming completely obsolete in 20 years, it does fill one of the potential gaps. Yes, they are your backup power station.
Right. So V2G, vehicle to grid. Right?
Vehicles grid, it's V2X now, because it can connect to anything you like.
Yes. Right. So really interesting perspective. So I think this point on the balance of transportation emissions, you said this yourself, and like not the biggest concern for the city, it's more buildings in town, but transportation has been a huge issue in this recent election, not least. So how do we approach that? How do we build this optimistic vision of what this could be?
Okay, so I'm going to do what I did last time. I'll talk about a positive thing, and then I will talk about the local elections, because people are going to ask me about it anyway. So, so I mean, positive thing. So we have a very small zero emission zone in Oxford. It is 6 streets. The pilot that went in just over 2 years ago now. And one of the sort of nice bits of innovation that has come out of this, which I mean, I certainly didn't expect, has been in the delivery space. So this is very interesting, because fundamentally, people do not care how their stuff gets to them. They only care that it gets to them, right? So actually, changing the mode of delivery is quite a sort of painless thing to do, really, if you can do. So certainly, I don't know if St Anthony's is involved in this trial, but one of the kind of problems in this city certainly is, lots of colleges, lots of students buying stuff from Amazon. What the sort of college porters all used to have to deal with was basically, like 20 odd Amazon Prime vans turning up throughout the day, chucking out a couple of parcels, parked illegally, there's lots of, colleges in the city centre, really sort of big problems there, both from a sort of climate angle, road safety angle. So one of the things that came out of the ZEZ, obviously lots of the colleges are inside the ZEZ, is there's a nice sort of little mini kind of freight consolidation thing that's happened with e-bikes. There's sort of trailers on e-bikes. Basically, the student stuff gets delivered just outside the city centre, gets consolidated onto basically per college little kind of tiny shipping containers, put on a sort of bespoke trailer and then shipped in once. So, 20 Amazon delivery vans stopping outside St Anthony's has just gone down to one little container. So that's really good. Really like that innovation. That's a positive thing. So certainly, yeah. So now we talk about the local elections that have just happened in Oxford. So we've just had a series of city council elections. There was no county council elections. City council is very much not the highways authority. But that did not matter. So the story certainly that I wanted to tell about about housing, about the inclusive economy, about keeping money in the city, about the basic genuinely award-winning climate action that this council does. Like basically nobody wanted to talk about that at all on the doorstep, like 100% of the time. The only thing that anybody in the city wants to talk about on the doorstep is transport, and most specifically low traffic neighbourhoods. So I think the sort of results of this have been quite interesting. So the map of Oxford is starting to look a little bit like that map of Bristol, where the middle is going green. I'm Labour, but it used to be Labour-run council, it's now a minority. Middle is going green. Outside where the council seats are sort of reddish. But the other dynamic in Oxford is a lot of those, basically Oxford Labour's got squeezed from both directions. It's getting squeezed by the Greens for not being pro enough, and then it's getting squeezed by independents, some of whom are literally like climate change deniers on this anti-LTN ticket, and they very much did win. In this election, and we do have to sort of obviously have to pay attention to that. And some of the reasons for this were, the vision is not communicated. The benefits are very much not felt equally across the city. In the middle of the city, the places where it's gone green, people love it, it's all fine. You go further out, that is just not true. Like, not true at all. And this is basically completely not just eroded trust, but effectively absolutely obliterated trust in the political system, and certainly trust in Oxford Labour. And a lot of this can actually be put on the sort of timing of funding again. Some of this stuff should not have gone in when it did, and it had to, because that's when the funding part was, like the end. So there's a bit of a sort of failing to tell the story, but also I think the reason that Oxford has basically been tearing itself to shreds about this for the past literally 3 years at this point, because it's really got to people's core value about fairness. They could see that some people have the advantages, but some people really, really don't. And this is sort of one of the key political risks in this space, and one that is certainly being felt in Oxford right now.
No, thank you for that really touched analysis. I think all the things you've been saying about what councils need, what local authorities need to succeed, come down to how do you get the right sequencing to do the policies you need, and how to build political support for that. If you don't have, if you need to get the thing in this time because the funding pot says there's a deadline for it, and how do you build the sort of sequence in a politics that works? Very hard to do. Not just about getting the raw stuff, but getting the right way to put it together. That's a really good segue back to our final kind of set of questions before we can come to the audience. I hope you're queuing them up. But we have now a big election coming up, I think. It feels like a big election anyway. We'll talk about it. Is there any prospect for changing some of this in the next government, whoever that might be? And what would that look like? How would an agenda to really empower every single local authority in this country to deliver what needs to deliver for climate targets look like? And how would you build support for that? It's a huge question. I don't know if we have all the answers, but I would be fascinated in the panel's thoughts on it. I think we've agreed current setup doesn't have the right resources, authority, powers to do what needs to be done. But how do we get it? How do we build it? And can we deliver a contract without it? Probably not, sounds like it, but what can we still do anyway? So I wonder if I could turn back to Chris Knox to start us off with that thought, but let's just take one quick set of reflections and then come to everyone else. Chris, want to start?
Yeah, so just briefly, I think it's about setting that destination where you want to be going to. So much of these arguments they come unstuck around the process, partly produced as we've talked about timing of competitions, but sort of the challenge is how if you're going to be able as a politician to sell a vision, you've got to be able to get on the door and make the case. How do you make the case? You've got to be able to build trust by demonstrating that in 5 years' time, like Ronald Reagan said, you will make your lives better by achieving X, Y, and Z. Now, what are X, Y, and Z that are going to capture the imagination? So we started off this way saying, "Oh, explain to us what ULEZ is," just to make sure everyone knew what it is. And that's a challenge in itself, because unless we start talking around what it's going to mean for the reduction in childhood asthma, and in some cases, pollution deaths in the elderly, what it's going to mean for potentially not just decarbonising roads, but also changing the entire makeup of roads, to come back again to looking at visually at what can be done. When I went around Europe in the early 2000s, there was plumes of smoke and cars just gridlocked, and now those cars are not on the road, and there are trees in their place. Go to Boston, you see where they stripped out the overhead sort of the old iron grid sort of system where the cars used to run above, and now it's this path that runs a strip right the way to the city centre. And that's just some small examples of what can be done. Once people see what can be done, they never want to go back to what they had. So where are those turning points where we can say, look, we will take you on this journey, and we promise you, you will not regret the decisions that need to be taken. They are difficult, and being honest with people about sort of there is pain for some people, and that fairness argument is a challenge, because there are some people who need to be recompensed, and getting those schemes right for people that bought the diesel car because they were told they had to buy a diesel car, and then find that it's the worst thing they should have bought. I understand that, and it's working with those people and not ignoring their fears, but also recognising people are playing on fears as well, and isolating and identifying who are the climate delayers, who were the climate deniers, because they are trying to seize this moment to take advantage. So sort of coming up with a positive sense of hope, vision, ideally in an outcomes mission-based approach. And it's very heartening that Keir Starmer has this sort of mission government. I hope that that's really hot-wired into government, so it's not just government departments competing against each other. There is going to be this green mission board. That's got to set the framework of what's going to be achieved, and then provide the cash for local authorities to be able to then sell that vision in the doorsteps.
Great. Alex, is it going to happen?
I like Chris's bit about climate deniers and being climate delayers, and afraid to say that I think they have captured the political system now, and I'm hoping that after the election, if we get a Labour government, that we will turn the page on that, and that's very much what we in the Labour Party are thinking about in terms of our mission. As I said, one of the 5 missions is to become a clean energy superpower, but it's much broader than that. And Chris also mentioned Joe Biden Inflation Reduction Act. That's where a lot of our thinking, a lot of our inspiration is coming from. And a lot of things that I've said tonight are things that are laid policy or are planned. So a land use framework, that's something that I worked on my last 6 months in DEFRA team, and that is something that we're committed to. A fabric first approach, something Labour's committed to, change the planning system in terms of transport that's not local authority level. The incredibly popular idea of bringing the railways back into public ownership, but also the idea that all of our buses should be under public control. We've actually got a real problem in this country in terms of devolution. It's a massive postcode lottery. No other country, says, we're going to do devolution. We'll do it here, but not there. We'll do it here, but not there. You either do it, or you don't do it. And we're gonna have to square that circle. And then what you've got an opportunity for, big opportunity for local authorities, I think, just posting an idea to our councillors here and to UK 100, that actually in the past a lot of us companies were run by the local authority, and that went. What we've got now is combined authorities under mayor. Mentioned Andy Burnham and the V network, and the combined authority and local authority are not the same thing. The combined authority can have control, the local authority can run the buses, and they can bid. They obviously won't run all the bus services, but they can bid for routes, and then all of that be integrated under a single card. And actually, I think our ambition, working with the mayors, is to see every mode of transport done on a single card. So electric bikes on the card, your car clubs on the same card, that your local rails, you've got national rails on the same card, your buses on the same card, and actually it will incentivise it as well. In our paper on Great British Railways, I prefer the name Rail Britannia. We talked about air miles, Avios type loyalty schemes. LNER's got the best one in the UK now. I hope that we take up the LNER scheme and roll it out, and roll it right across. And people who've got cars be like, what am I getting out of driving a car when I can get all of this through all of this integrated multi-transport, and I get time to watch a film, listen to some music. Well,
I look forward to your rendition of Rail Britannia after the segment, but no, it's I think this is a really you know, ambitious set of reforms for a government that may be coming in to propose. I think the question I'm curious as a I'll hear my voice, a non-UK resident, someone comes from a federal country, United States, is there a future, you think, for this country where there's more power given to local authorities, including for raising taxes, making decisions, and that is going beyond where I see the current set of manifesto reading. But if I heard our first discussion right, there's actually something about building trust, building politics, building effectiveness that's needed for the climate challenge that might be quite structural in some ways.
Mhm.
It's a thought. And is that possible? I don't know if anyone wants to pick it up, but let me actually put that to you, Chris, because I think you might have a thought on that.
Yes, it should be. If you think about, we kind of want to devolve responsibility down to local government, but we don't always want to give them the ability to be able to deliver things. And if you think about council tax, so it's that one kind of lever that councils have to put a taxation on the entirety of the populace in its area. For a number of years, that was capped by the government because they didn't want to see councils raising a lot of the revenue that was being taken away nationally, being kind of raised locally through that taxation, whether that was right or that was wrong, but it's meant that it's still quite a low tax base. If you look at different kind of interventions that some councils have done, actually they're quite popular. So Nottingham City Council has done the workplace parking levy. If you don't know what that is, that's your homework for tonight. It's a really useful transport intervention, but still to this day, only one council's ever done it 10 years on, and that's Nottingham. And you still need, so if Oxford City County Council wants to do it, it needs to get Secretary of State approval for it. So if we're genuinely looking at resetting that relationship, which is what I think is required, we then need to empower these areas to make these decisions, whether for good or for ill, and have that local democratic accountability to that. Why it's so important that local authorities is the answer to a lot of our climate questions is because they have kind of the ability to influence around 80% of emissions in a local area. That's not their own emissions, that's not their own direct emissions, that's the entirety of the area, the businesses, the residents, and everything else. So they have that unique convening role, which needs to be encouraged and empowered to meet those climate goals. And PwC come out with a report which said that if a transition is locally led, it could save around 130 billion compared to if it comes from Westminster and Whitehall. So I would say the net zero transition can be delivered cheaper, faster, and better if it's done by local authorities than if it's just done by government on its own. The two need to work hand in hand, but let's empower councils to actually make that transition possible.
Great. Anna, thoughts on this bigger question?
I guess if there is a Labour government after the next general election, I guess the problem with getting power is you don't really want to give it away when you've got it. So yes, I think I agree with everything that Chris has just said. I guess we'll see, won't we? I would like to think that a Labour government would devolve some power downwards. The sort of different devolution deals. This is the thing, like one size really doesn't fit all in this country. Oxford is a great example. 160,000 people. Pretty different to sort of Andy Burnham in Manchester, isn't it? It's not big enough for a unitary. What do you do with that? So I watch this space and I'm hopeful.
Thanks. Last word, Pete. What are we thinking from the council?
Okay, so at the beginning of this administration, well, it's actually it was three parties, Lib Dems, Green, and Labour, and we all agreed that we wanted to be in the lead on climate, not to be cool, but because actually the evidence internationally is we are simply failing, and if you're not leading, you're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I think we've got the headlines as to why it should be great. You should be ending pollution, eliminating waste, getting investment, leading the fourth industrial revolution, and getting on the front foot against the greatest threat to our health, wealth, and well-being that there has ever been. Those are quite good headlines. And what we really need, and Chris has proposed this, is we need the responsibility officially, statutorily given to local government, and it needs to be funded because Chris has also said what he doesn't want to see is loads of councils in court being sued by their own people for failing to deliver stuff because, as you said, the government's really good at giving us responsibility and then not giving us the wherewithal to do it. So you have to be serious about it. Now, I have to say, I heard Ed Miliband talking in Innovation Zero last week, and it was like having the lights turned on after the miasma and fug of this current government. He was clear, he was focused, he understands what government needs to do. He talked about working with all parties and making this happen. And I thought, yes, that's what we need. We need someone who is prepared to do what it takes to get climate change tackled, and not just climate change. Actually, there's another 5 planetary boundaries we could also trash the planet by ignoring. So there's all that to do. But I just like us really to, local authorities, counties, top tier authorities, you are responsible for convening around climate change. Get on with it, because that's what we're doing anyway. But it would be nice to be doing it with a statutory heft as well as just by power of persuasion.
Great. Well, I think this is a really fascinating topic to consider, and it's not just one that is relevant for the UK, of course, or for local authorities, but no government has had to make decisions in an era shaped by climate change. This is a new phenomenon, right? It's going to be with us for better or worse trajectories for decades and centuries indeed to come. So it'd be surprising if our governance systems remained completely untouched and unmodified by this. So some really big picture choices that need to be made in this country and all countries on how best to approach that. But let's first, before coming to those, think about some questions from our fantastic audience here. So if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand. Please wait for the microphone to arrive to you before speaking. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself